Welcome in everyone to a very special episode of American Joyride. I am joined today by former Army Ranger Johnny Elsasser. I'm super excited to have you here. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. I was honored to be asked to come on the show, and I'm looking forward to jamming out with you for a little while.
Yeah, I caught you on Jeff Struker's podcast. I know Jeff a little bit. I really enjoyed it. Jeff is a great guy, and that's how I found you. And I'm like, I got to reach out to this guy. I got to get him on my own show. So that's why we're here. And like I said in the introduction, you're a former Army Ranger. Could you walk the audience real quick how you came to be an Army Ranger and what your role within the Rangers was?
Yeah, I actually have a wild story how I ended up in becoming a Ranger. And it actually wasn't like me just having a contract and going into it. It's kind of fortuitous. The universe kind of took its role in there. But part of it was, I grew up blue collar family. I grew up working on cars, detailing airplanes, pretty gritty kind of stuff growing up, and didn't really have any other concept of dealing with life other than hard work, right? I just knew that to be the way of life. That was my family. That's how we lived. So I played a lot of sports, grew up hardworking blue collar family. And as I started to end my time in high school, I started seeing a bunch of my friends come to school with their acceptance letters for college. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I think I missed a memo here, like, because I did none of this, right? I didn't do ACTs, SATs. I didn't apply to any colleges. I was like, holy crap. I don't think I did anything here, right? And I was sitting there seeing them come to school. And earlier that year, it was very funny. A friend of mine, this is obviously before social media and like smartphones and stuff. He comes up to me. He has these printed papers of like special operations groups. And it's like Army Rangers, Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Pararescue, like all these spec ops groups. And I didn't know anything really about any of them except what I'd seen in movies. And so I remember coming across the Army Rangers in his little printouts, and I was like, oh, those guys seem like pretty cool. That's like pretty dope. They're just going and being a hammer to a thumbtack pretty much. And so I was like, this is awesome. Well, fast forward back to me exiting high school. Well, I didn't do anything for college, so I ended up stumbling my way into an Army recruiting office. And that was really because my mother's boyfriend at the time was former Air Force. And he was like, hey, if you don't know what to do, maybe you just go into one of these offices, check out what the military has to offer. And I was like, all right, that seems cool. So I get in there and I start talking to this guy about going into the Army. This is 2004, mind you. So we were really hot in Iraq. We'd been in Afghanistan for a couple of years, and Iraq was going off. Specifically, Fallujah was really hot at the time. And so he's like, yeah, we could use you in the regular Army, the infantry, all these things. I was like, well, what about these Army Rangers? He's like, we can talk about that later. I was a 17-year-old kid. So I'm like, all right, whatever. So a couple months go by and I go to San Jose, which is the medical and processing center for California, at least where I was located in California in Fresno. That was one of the medical and processing centers. So I go there, pass all the medical stuff, and that's where you really sit down with the guy that gets you to sign the contract. And this dude's got a special forces tab. He's got a Rangers tab. He's got, obviously all the other things that are associated with that. And he's sitting there and I'm like, hey, can I get a Ranger contract? And he's like, well, we're going to put you to third ID. And once you get there, you can talk to them about going Rangers and they'll get you there. And I was like, all right, I guess 17-year-old kid, don't know any better. So I go through the process, go through basic training. I get into basic training with a contract to go to Broken TV, which is third ID. And I'm sitting there and my drill sergeant calls me over one day after chow. And I'd been a soccer player my whole life. So I was running the 2 mile in like 11 minutes and like 30 seconds. I maxed out all my PT scores. So he's like, this guy's a stud. Let me talk to him. So he brings me over. He goes, hey, what contract do you want? You want to go Special Forces? At the time they had 18, I believe it's X-ray was their program to go basic training straight to Special Forces. He's like, you want to go Special Forces? Do you want to go be a sniper? Do you want to be reconnaissance? Do you want to go be an Army Ranger? I was like, that Army Ranger. He goes, cool, get upstairs. Next day, I'm not even kidding you, leaving chow again, he calls me over. Elsasser, come here, run over there, pulls the contract out in front of me and says, sign this. Literally turns around. I sign this contract for Airborne Army Rangers on his back. And the next thing I know, I'm going in the pipeline to airborne school. When I get out of basic training, go to RIP, which is Ranger at the time was Ranger Indoctrination Program, which is now RASP. and then went to 2nd Ranger Battalion after I survived RIP. And so that was kind of like this fortuitous way that it showed up for me. And it was just kind of like, all right, you're meant to be here.
And where is the 2nd Battalion based out of? Is that in Savannah?
No. That's 1st Battalion. 3rd Battalion's down in Fort Benning, Georgia. And then we were Hollywood. So we were called the Hollywood Kids, but we were up in Washington State.
In Washington, yep. So for the audience who doesn't know, there's Fort Benning, then there's Savannah, and then there's the other Ranger Battalion up in Washington.
Correct.
So we got 3 of them, and they're all incredibly badass. So how long after you complete the pipeline, now you're an Army Ranger, did it take for you to get your first deployment, and where was that first deployment to?
Man, it was pretty fast. Like I actually got there, if I remember correctly, we made it through the I think we got kind of like laid over we got laid over in the Christmas break. Then I hit RIP and then past RIP, and I was at Ranger Battalion in February of like 2005. And then we ended up deploying like March of 2005, if I remember correctly. So it was like literally a month in battalion, having to get spun up, having to get understand how they operate, how our team operated, how our squad operated, how our platoon operated, everything. And then get deployed. And we went to northern Iraq on that first deployment, where it was pretty bad. We were hunting a pretty, gnarly terrorist cell, which complements to our whole platoon. Ended up taking down in one deployment. And that was pretty, but we were running about like 6 missions a night, every night, just constantly. So I was already on deployment like a month after being in battalion. It was like right into the frying pan.
Was there, let me rewind real quick. Was there much of a culture shock for you? You know, you're a young kid, like you said, you were 17 when you signed up. You had no idea where you were coming from. And now you're around some of the toughest dudes on the planet, some of whom I assume have had plenty of combat experience already. And now you're just this young man. Like, did they accept you right away, or was there a transition period where you kind of got a wake-up call to what you were about to be a part of?
Oh, there was a transition period of wake up call for sure. There was like not a single, I didn't own my nights or weekend. I didn't own a minute of my day except when I was sleeping. That was about it. And then if they chose to interject themselves there, they would, right? Like battalion was worse than the pipeline to get to battalion, because at the end of the day, those guys were like, no, you're keeping me alive. I want to make sure you have everything that I believe a Ranger should have to keep me alive and watch my back. And so they were hard on us, man. Like it was rough. So we didn't own our nights. We didn't own our weekends. It was a huge culture shock. And the standard was so high that it's like, because, in special operations, they can, especially in Ranger Battalion, we can do what's called RFS, release for standard. And so one of the benefits of being in Spec Ops, because it's the top 1%, is you can actually get kicked out. And I have done that as a sergeant. We had to get one guy kicked out because he wasn't meeting the standard. He was compromising people when we went overseas. And that was part of the culture you had to live with. And so if you couldn't meet that standard, they could get rid of you. And I had to meet this very high standard. The fortunate thing that I had going for me was that I did grow up in high level of sports, high level of hard work, but also I grew up like being super present. So every day was just literally what was in front of me. I didn't look to tomorrow. I didn't look to next week. And I think that was part of my success in Ranger Battalion, and why like that culture shock was very dramatic for me. I'd never experienced this top tier, like super bad dudes that freaking had to overseas, had seen combat, all of those things. I hadn't experienced that in my life. But when you got there, you weren't accepted. You had to earn every ounce of respect that it took to get those guys to bring you into their circle and have that respect for you. And you didn't feel that respect until you earned it. And so that was another thing. It was like, oh wow, like these guys don't care who you are, what background. Like I had a kid that came when I was a sergeant. He came in to our platoon, and he was one of the grandsons of like a legendary Army Ranger, and we gave him zero respect and credibility because that. And so that was it. You had to earn it. Didn't matter who you were. And so that was also a culture shock for me, but it also told me that, hey, you have to put in the effort. It's not going to get handed to you. So you got to show up every day. So these guys actually respect you. They trust you. They like you. They want to have a beer with you afterwards. You wanted that to be the culture, but you had to earn that.
I love that. I love that. Nothing given, everything earned. So let's go back to your first deployment. One of my favorite things to get the insight of is what was the difference between your perception of what you thought it was going to be like and then what it actually was like? How are those two things different?
Oh man. Um, that's a great question. When I look at what I thought it was supposed to be like, because you're repetitively hitting training and you're doing it like, I mean, yeah, we have certain aspects where we bring in Op 4, which is operations where they just counter operations to us. So they act, it's physical human people that act as the enemy. But there's a level of gaming to all of that, right? So like you're seeing it and you're experiencing it, and you're like, okay, we're trained in all these things, but it's never going to happen. Like you're not going to get blown up, or you're not going to get shot at. Like there was this kind of disconnect being a kid and not really understanding that, like, you know, that was just in the movies and all the movies were make believe, but that's not real. Like you're still just gaming everything when you're back in training, and we train hard, but it's still that essence of a game, right? You know, you're not pulling a trigger and a real person is on the other side of that gun. You know, if you get in a hand-to-hand fight, like there's a level of somebody tapping out, or there is a level of somebody saying, okay, you know, white flag, right? Like there is all this like gaming aspect, but the reality when you get over there is like, oh dude, when that breach goes off and you're going into an objective and all of a sudden there's live human beings on there that want to kill you worse than you want to kill them, and you're like, oh, this is all like not make believe anymore. It's a dramatic shock. Like you realize like, okay, there's no holding back. Like you have to be the first to be the aggressor if the situation poses itself that your life is threatened or someone else's life threatened. You also have to realize that like there's no holding back on your strength. If there's a hand-to-hand situation that comes into play, it's like, oh, I'm not holding back. There's no like, oh, I'm going to tap out, or this guy's going to tap out, or oh, like reserve your strength because you don't want to go too hard on them. You're like, no. This is full game. Like this is game mode, and you are just absolutely 100%. You have to put every ounce of yourself into the effort that you put behind it. And you have it to a certain extent, but you don't have it when you're in training. And that was the difference for me. And I'd never experienced that. I'd never been like almost a no holds bar until I was in combat. And you're like, oh man, they're not holding anything back from us. We can't hold anything back from them. There's no safety. There's no white flag. There's no, oh, okay, we'll be nice now. That's not how they play. And so when you realize that, you're like, oh dude, this is a different environment.
To cite a famous Ranger movie, Black Hawk Down, which you just said, kind of reminds me of the line in Black Hawk Down where Eric Bana, who's playing the Delta guy, says
Yeah.
the moment that first bullet goes flying past your head, everything else goes out the window. It's just about you and the man next to you. That line is always, I've always loved that line. And it kind of sounds exactly what you're saying now. Like once the bullets start flying, all bets are off. Is that an accurate assessment?
Oh, 100%. Especially once you know the rules of engagement is they're willing to kill you. Cool. You better match that rule of engagement because they're not going to hold back. And that's absolutely right. Like that line. And they actually, one of our old, I believe it was one of our first sergeants, First Sergeant Fuller, before I got to 2nd Ranger Battalion Alpha Company. He was one of the people who lent credibility and support to Black Hawk Down when they were doing the movie. But those types of lines, that's real. Like that is real. It is about the brothers next to you, because at the end of the day, like when you're in this sympathetic nervous state and you're reacting on instinct and to that lowest level of consistent training you've ever had, when you react to that level, your job literally is like, my brother's next to me. Like you can't think or see of anything else. It's literally them next to me, and then how do we accomplish this mission with everybody alive?
Is there one moment you go back to or you think back to where you said that was the moment it became real for me? Like that night or that event, like that was the moment it became this, I could die over here. Is there a moment that
Yeah.
sticks out to you like that? What is it?
Well, there's quite a few. I would say my first deployment, the moment that I was like, oh, this is legit, like everybody's fighting and everybody's putting in the same effort. We were on like probably, I think it was around like our fourth mission. And one of the squad leaders, and at the time, again, I'm brand new. So all I'm looking at is like, I've always been clearing rooms with my team leader and my saw gunner and then my other, squad members, and then my squad leader, right? Like that was it. So I'm used to like clearing rooms, like with guys that I'm very familiar with, who I train with day in, day out. And then one of the other sergeants from one of the other squads, we were in this massive complex. And I'm standing outside of a room and I'm like, hey, I need one. And I get one and I feel somebody right on my back. I feel their shoulder in my back. And I'm like, cool, we're ready to go. So we go into the room, we clear this room and come back to the door. And as I'm coming back to the door, I look over and it's like, one of the sergeants from the other squads. And I was like, oh, he just jumped in here and he didn't take lead. He let me lead. And I was like, oh, this is real. Like that made it very real to me that like, number one, I started to earn the trust of being a Ranger. But number two, he was jumping into room clearing too. There was nothing above him that he was going to just give to us, right? He wasn't like, oh, that's below me, I'm not going to do that. Like he was clearing just a regular room and it was to help secure this objective. And that made it very real to me. Like we always knew that like people could obviously die overseas, especially after starting to get more missions under our belts and stuff like that. But I would say the first instance again was on that first deployment. And the most wild thing was there was two high-level operators walking to chow, and where we were stationed at in northern Iraq, we would wake up to getting mortared every single day. Like it was just like mortar rounds coming in. And these two high-level operators from a different unit were going to chow and got hit with a mortar. And if I remember correctly, they both died or got severely injured. And I was like, oh, these dudes got injured. These dudes got killed. Like I was like, oh, bro, we're all on notice now. Like this could happen to any of us. And so it was pretty intense to have that realization that like, okay, we're all vulnerable now. There is no more of like, oh, we're elite, we're spec ops, like we're untouchable because we're so much better than them. It didn't matter. That was a freaking mortar round that flew over and got them. It wasn't even, direct combat with someone else with a gun in front of them. So that made it very real to me that, oh, okay, like any one of us could go at any time and we don't necessarily have a say. It could be that 50-50 chance.
Well, it's like the old saying goes, the bullet doesn't know what it's about to hit when it comes out of the barrel. It's just
Nope.
flying, it's just flying in the direction it's flying in. Did you notice anything changed about you personally after you did your first deployment? And if anything did change, was it in a negative way, a positive way? And how'd you handle the first of what became many deployments?
It's a great question because it's almost a double-edged sword. A lot of it was very positive, and it was positive to keep me at the top level that I was at for being a ranger, for training, for deployments, for constantly trying to be better, all those things. So part of that was the judgment of other people. Part of that was ascertaining the environment around you, no matter where you were. So that could be out at a coffee shop, that could be out at a restaurant, that could be just in battalion when you guys are going out and doing training. So you had this high level of vigilance that you carried with you, and then you were always assessing threats. Now, to the extent of like way beyond what people think the average walking in and be like, that guy's the threat, that guy's the threat. No, like we were assessing the entire environment for threats, and then also the entire environment for safe havens, for cover, for concealment, for all those things if something went down, right? And so we carried a lot of this vigilance with us back, which I never had before deployment. And then always looking at people and just thinking of the threat they could pose based on their demeanor, based on their physicality, based on, the way their eyes were moving, where their hands were. We were just constantly assessing people. At least I was. This is what I carried back from me. And I say it because we'll talk about it later, but when I got out of protection, out of battalion, all of those things, and I finally got back to the States, like that stuff doesn't actually help you for having a normal life. It actually starts to detract from it. And so that's why it became a double-edged sword. But at the time, it was super helpful. It helped me to continually raise the bar, but it also helped me to continually practice a skill that served me every single time I went overseas. Because at the end of the day, when you go into an objective and you see people inside of the building, you have a split second to say, I'm taking my gun off fire and I'm, or I'm keeping it on safe, and I'm going to detain these people because they don't have a way to harm my life, right? Like, so you're making these split second decisions, but you constantly have to have that level of development on vigilance to make the split second decision. So practicing it back home was super helpful for me on all the deployments that I went on after that.
Well, it's fascinating you say that when it comes to like how you don't think that can help you long term, those skills. Tyler Gray, former Army Ranger turned actor, member of CAG, he says that for him, when his brain got wired to love chaos, that the wiring could never be undone. That his brain, he had to learn forever just how to embrace healthy chaos, is what he says now. But his
Yeah.
brain was wired for that because that he was in Rangers, Delta, et cetera, et cetera. For you, like you just said, those skills don't help you long term. So what do you do then when you're out, but you've been trained and this is ingrained in you? How do you unwire that or step back from it?
Yeah, and I'll caveat this. Those are great skills to always have. Those are always in my toolbox. It's just nowadays I don't live and die by them. I actually I choose to turn them on, right? Like it's almost a switch, right?
Gotcha.
And I would say that yes, Tyler could reprogram this, and I'll tell you why. Because Dr. Joe Dispenza has done a lot of work on what's called synaptic pruning and reprogramming, and there is a valid way that you could actually do this and change that synaptic wiring within your own brain. So part of that is just coming through the development of understanding what those tools were and how they served you, and then taking a look at how they're not serving you anymore. So taking a look at your relationships or the people you're allowing into your life, or the fact that, like, for instance, you may be in a lot of arguments with your wife because she's like, bro, you're judging everybody around you all the time. We can't go out to the grocery store. I say that because my wife had this conversation with me the other day, because I still have some of those tendencies, but I'm more aware of them now to be able to, okay, I got to recalibrate. But when we look at it, we have to ascertain, okay, what is serving us and what is not serving us. And so when we realize that there's certain aspects of that aren't serving us, from creating new friendships, new circles, inviting new people into our lives, or even having deeper connections with our wives or our kids, like, then we have to say, okay, if it's not serving me to have that happiness, how do I remove that? And that's actually taking part in saying, okay, what is a reframe of that perspective? Or, hey, how do I question that perspective before I say something, right? And that's pretty much part of what I've done a lot of, because I used to say things, or I would just keep looking around. I'd have to tell my wife, like, hey, I'm just looking around because it's like been one of my lifestyles. I'm actually paying attention to you. But then I realized, like, I need to focus on her, and I can just pay attention loosely by walking in and ascertaining really quick, like, what my environment is, and then leaving it at that. Right. And then it doesn't mean you're not paying attention, just means you're not having to be super vigilant, like you're protecting the US ambassador, or like you're going out and you're actually hunting terrorists. So it's having the awareness of saying, there is a way to break that cycle. It just takes what's called synaptic pruning, and then re-hardwiring of synapses. And in that, you can start to drive a different narrative where it doesn't take you down the path of always being hyper vigilant, that you're in a hunting mode or in a protection mode.
One of the things that, again, that I love getting different opinions on, and I hear both sides of it, is when you were overseas and on deployment, was it strictly business when it came to engaging the enemy, or was it personal? And for example, I've interviewed some guys from tier one units. They say it was never personal. Every time I pulled the trigger, it was a business decision. I've heard other guys say it didn't start personal, but after I lost 4 or 5 friends, it became personal every time I went outside the wire. I think both of those answers are completely justifiable for different reasons, and ultimately it's up to them. For you, when you were out there, bullets were flying, you were in combat, you were trying to save people, was it strictly business, or did it ever seep into that personal world?
That is a really cool question. I do love this. And like, as you said, I have to say that specifically, and part of why I think there is, um, I have my own speculation on like the fact that I think that there's a lot of spec ops guys who may not have experienced PTSD as we see it in like the regular military. And part of that is because I think a lot of us did look to it as personal. Now that's my own, or I mean, sorry, business. That's my own perception, right? Like I felt it was more business. I felt it was more like, hey, they're opposing forces. We're doing what we're trained to do, and we're going to execute that at a higher level than they are. When whatever the situation calls for, whether it's capturing, whether it's killing, whether it's whatever, right? So I took it as more business. Everything was, for me, it was the business of this flag, right? Like the United States of America. We were handling the business of the US, and that's what we were doing. Even when I lost friends, when we lost people overseas, I still can't say that I went out just hunting because it was personal. I would say that it still always fell under the business mindset. And I love this question because it almost gives me a little more insight, because people ask me a lot about the PTSD stuff. And I was like, I never really experienced it my personally, and I don't have a lot of friends that have. And I know a lot of us looked at, going overseas as handling that business. So I would say it was more business from my perspective than personal, even after we lost people.
That's a great answer. I love that. I love that answer, and I
Yeah.
think the audience is going to love that too. I do. I do. I want to kind of pivot now to where you were working with the ambassador in Iraq, but before that is a gap. When you decided to leave the military, that can be a really difficult decision for a lot of people.
Yeah.
They feel like they lost something. They lost a brotherhood. They lost a sense of purpose. For you, that transition out, were there any major struggles you encountered?
I think the biggest decision I had, and a couple of good buddies and I, we were all the same age. We're all really young when we got in, and we all got out at the same time. And the biggest decision I had during that point was the fact that I loved actually being a Ranger, but I did not like the current politics that were coming into play at the time, which at that time it was Obama in 2008, early 2008. And we had gotten wind of the changes to rules of engagement that were going to take place, and kind of put us in a position that we were way more vulnerable, even as high level as we were. It just was going to make us and every operator more vulnerable. And I didn't
Real
really.
quick, can you explain, just because the audience is going to want to know, like, is there an example you can say of like what was going to change that you felt was uncomfortable with the rules of engagement?
One of the main examples I have was that he was going to shut off nighttime operations for like spec ops units. So that was one thing that came down the pipeline. Now, I can't remember if that actually came to fruition or not for any time, for any period within the war, but at the time that was part of what he was talking about, was like, we're going to shut off like nighttime missions for spec ops, and they were going to do something like force everybody to just operate during the daytime. And I was like, that seems a little stupid, because that's like when we have the biggest advantage, right? Like,
Right.
so I was like, all right, that's kind of dumb. So that was one of the examples that he was going to change. And then I can't remember the specifics on the ROEs, but he was going to change the rules of engagement as to, when we actually fired on an enemy, how we deployed bombs and things like that to our advantage for aerial attacks. So there was a lot of changes that we were hearing were going to come down. And I was at the precipice of saying, okay, like I had to re-up or I had to get out. And I was like, well, if I'm unsure of re up because we're hearing these things and we don't know when or if they're going to come into play, like what's my next option? So for me, the reason why I didn't feel like I was losing, I mean, I felt like I was losing a little bit of a brotherhood, but I didn't feel like that to some extent, because when I went into protection, I went into a group that was only special operations at the time. So I went in, it was only Rangers, it was special forces, it was SEALs, it was pararescue. So it was all these dudes, force recon. It was only dudes from the spec ops community that were allowed in this company. And so when I went there, that was what they were comprised of. So I felt like I was still within that spec ops community. And at the time, it was Triple Canopy, right? And they were started by a former CAG dude. And Triple Canopy at the time did not take over the Baghdad contract. They were still in these small little areas around Iraq. And they kept their community to only special operations. They had to increase their community to everybody when they ended up taking over Baghdad after Nassour Square.
Gotcha. Okay, so
Yeah.
so for the audience who might not have any idea what it's like to protect an ambassador, please correct me if I'm wrong. You have diplomatic security service at an embassy, and that could be one or two guys. Like in the movie 13 Hours, those are the guys that are like with Chris Stevens,
Yeah.
and then there's extra security that's brought in, which is what you're doing, is an extra layer for the ambassador, and that's contracting, correct?
Yeah, and really we're not even an extra layer. We are the layer.
You
So
are the
like
layer. Okay.
the DS agent is, so for instance, the ambassador ran with an agent in charge, right? So it was one guy that was specifically to the ambassador, and everything the ambassador did, predominantly everything the ambassador did, he was attached to him, even around the embassy and stuff like that to a certain extent, right? And so that agent was always walking around with them. They were the protector of the ambassador. And then when we went out on movement, that's when the team came in and did all the protection for the ambassador. So we ran the vehicle detail, we ran any type of walking formations. If he had a long walk outside, we ran all the direct protection for him. We were the actual external layer. And then the AIC was just kind of with him as like, hey, if something happens, I'm going to grab him by the freaking collar, bring him down, and then do my protection. Right. So that was kind of their role, but we were everything else. And to include buttoning up around him if we had to. Yeah. So that was kind of the experience.
And are you armed with like M4s and like
Yeah.
standard military arms? And so this is my main meat of the question. When you're a ranger, I assume, hey, that guy's got an AK, he's walking towards us. Rules of engagement say take him out. But now you're protecting a diplomat. So how do the
Yeah.
rules change for when you can engage someone, and how are you searching for that differently?
Yeah, so you've got to switch the mindset now. So you're in a defensive posture. So in Rangers, we're in that aggressor, right? We're at the hunter kind of position. But in the protection world, you're in a defensive posture. So you're reacting to the environment, and you also have to take into consideration that anything you do is a reflection of the United States, because you have the preeminent person, the preeminent representative to the United States that you're protecting. So it becomes a massive international incident, no matter what happens, right? Like there were times where we were going around and they were using these things called sparklers, and they were like these. Have you ever heard of these?
Like you light them like the firework thing?
No. We call them like a sparkler. It's like a super bright, like laser that you could see in daytime. And you would basically, we would have them in the vehicle, and we used to have like a trunk position. So someone who could flip open a back door, and then they'd have like a gun out there that they could shoot behind us. But obviously, as Iraq gained their sovereignty and things became relatively, I hesitate to say the word, but a little more peaceful, right? Like we went to different rules of engagement, which there was a process to it. And part of that process was like this sparkler where it was great. It worked really well. And you could just take it and flash up, and like it would get in somebody's eyes like real quick, or you just flash it on the hood of their car, they'd see it, and then they'd like back off the convoy, right? Or they'd back off the motorcade. And it was just to keep a little bit of distance from us, so we couldn't be engaged by like, say, a vehicle bomb, right? So anyways, these things were great. We would use them, but then they changed the rules of engagement that you had to actually document if you use this thing, which was asinine to me. But like they wanted to do that. So we had all these different aspects of being able to protect, and we did have this defensive posture that we were just looking at everything and then dictating our level of interference based upon the threat it posed to the U.S. ambassador. So like I said, cars were really tough as we started to get more red tape put in the way, because you'd be in traffic circles just surrounded by vehicles, right? And like any one of them could have been a vehicle bomb. But at the end of the day, you were taking this and then looking at the environment and saying, okay, is this an imminent threat? Does this person look like they want to harm us? Are they giving us too much attention? Like what's going on here? So that defensive posture meant that you were pretty much anticipating to react as opposed to being the first to react or being the first to engage, right? So now you're put on a reaction, and it's like your reaction time had to be very fast because you potentially had a, you know, one shot to like get off, right? And that was kind of engaging. But we were sitting there, and yeah, we'd be at venues, and we'd be at like Maliki, who was the prime minister at the time, and you'd be going to Maliki's and all his men are armed. So you're sitting there walking up and handing over the ambassador on a venue, and the AIC is going in with him to go speak with Maliki. And then like everybody else is armed from Maliki's force. Right. And you're like, oh, wow, this is very different.
Well, that's like that. That what was it? 2018 in Afghanistan when they had that insider attack on that four-star general, the head of America, Austin Miller. No, not Austin Miller. The
Um,
old. You know
I'm
what I'm
trying to
talking
remember.
about, right? It's
Yes.
Austin
Yes.
something.
Yeah.
And they then disarmed the Afghan security detail whenever he was around, and the a Ranger
Mm.
killed that guy. So yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. Yeah, you're delivering a guy potentially to hostile. I mean, it takes one of those bodyguards to be a bad dude, and you have a major
Ex-
problem on your hands.
Exactly. And it's such a corrupt, it was such a corrupt area, and it was such a corrupt like way of life that it could have been any one of them. We started to work a little bit with the Iraqi police. It was an effort to show like joint continuity between the US and Iraq when they had their sovereignty and stuff. So we started to work with them, and I played soccer still. So I carried on my soccer years when I was overseas, and we would play on the US embassy, and we would play soccer against the Iraqi police. We'd get them onto the embassy, we'd play with them. We made friends with them. A couple of them would ride with us to help us facilitate movements and things like that. And one of the times, this guy didn't show up to one of the soccer games, and we're like, "Oh, you know, where's Muhammad?" And or no, this was Ahmed. I was like, "Where's Ahmed?" And he's like, "Oh, Ahmed got killed." And we're like, "What?" And he had been killed because they found out that he was working with the US forces, so they went over and killed him. And so it was like this whole thing of like, yeah, you never knew who was going to be bad. You never knew if they were put in danger and their life was threatened, if they didn't do something or their family's life was threatened. Like, this was happening on a regular basis. It was it's real scenarios that could have taken place at any moment, for sure.
Did you ever have any super close calls with the ambassador?
Um, we did not in particular have any close calls with the ambassador as far as like having to button him up or rush him to a vehicle or hard point him inside of a building or anything. We did have probably one of our most tenuous scenarios was we took him out to a place called Solder City, and
Oh yeah.
Solder City was owned by Solder. So like very dangerous, but he was also like the king of that city. Like nobody else could rule it. Even Maliki, like Solder had all the power there. And I think it was about the month before a British principal and I think his detail had been killed in the city. And we watched the video of the gunfight, all the stuff. So it was like a pretty gnarly thing that we were stepping into, knowing that had just happened in Solder City, like a month or less before we took the ambassador there. So we were on incredibly, I mean, we were always on high alert, especially when we took him to the red zone, but that was one that was pretty intense because we were like, bro, this is pretty fresh. Like, and we have no clue, because the idea is that, you know, my opinion is that would have probably had to have been sanctioned by Solder. Like that couldn't have just taken place, right? Like, because that's in his city, that fractures his relationship with the occupying forces, because the Brits were there, the US was there, all these other different people trying to create relations in Iraq. So it was very interesting to have that perspective of potentially this was sanctioned by the guy we're going to meet right now.
This is a little bit off topic, but I think it's relevant because of your experience guarding an ambassador and in the military. You always turn on the news and you hear of Americans that like get arrested in Mexico and they think they can like run to the embassy, or like, you know, some black ops team is going to swoop in and save them. If you're an American and you're in trouble overseas, like is the embassy actually going to be able to help you, or are you kind of on your own and you should just try to get out of the country?
I actually have a good perspective of this because my wife, when she was in Peru, something happened. I was not with her, and she was with her mom visiting Peru, and they went to travel. And at the time there was and this will get to your answer. I apologize if it's a long story, but
No,
it's
go. You got
worth
all the time in the world.
it's worth noting because they were in Peru, and at the time, apparently the Peruvians would do these protests to fracture tourism, right? Because this was their way to get back at the government. So they would create these big roadblocks, burning tires, big boulders and everything. They'd have like tire chains and tire irons and like all these pitchforks and all these other things, and they would scare the heck out of freaking tourists to then get tourists to not come back or to scare tourists to leave early. And then that hurt the government making money because out in Machu Picchu and Cusco, a lot of that's from tourism, right? So their idea was, well, my wife and her mom were there at the time, and they were coming down from Machu Picchu, and they got caught in one of these roadblocks. And these people start running at their car, and the taxi guy flips the thing in reverse. He's like, you ever seen the movie Captain Ron back in the day with Kurt Russell? Oh my God. Anyways, they ended up like backing up, finding this little neighborhood, which there's not many. And they ended up parking the car like in darkness, turning off the lights like nobody was in it, and watching this like crowd of people run by them. So my wife at the time, somehow, I can't remember how she was able to get some service, but got connected with me. And I said, and I was working for the State Department at the time. So I called up the RSO in country, and I was like, hey, my wife's over there. What can you guys do? They were like, hey, give us her phone number. We can ping it, figure out where she's located. We can send police out to her. So at the end of the day, they started reaching out to her. They connected her with local police. The local police were reaching out to her to get connected with her and then potentially escort them in, right? So to some extent, if you have the knowledge to utilize the U.S. Embassy, they actually can do limited functions to help you if something happens in country. But you're not getting John Krasinski to come after you. You're not getting some Black Ops team to come save you. Like, this stuff's not happening. You got to know the right numbers to call. I would highly recommend anybody traveling just submit your information to the embassy in that area so they know you're in country. But like, playing that game and knowing who to contact is really all you have the opportunity to do, because at the end of the day, they have no authority outside of the embassy. They have to contact local authorities to support, which they'll do, and they typically have great relationships with, but you have to know the buttons to push. It's not like the movies. If you are the person that a Black Ops team is going to save, you are probably the ambassador or somebody of a high level ranking in politics.
Yeah, so there you go, audience. Write the numbers down, submit your information. I'll tell you something. That story reminds me of something. I'll tell you when we're done filming. I don't want to bring it up on air, but it's interesting. You'll like it. All right, now one of the things I find most fascinating about you in your social media presence is the talk of masculinity, and I want to dive into this with you because number one, I feel like in the year 2023, there's a lot of people who hear the word masculinity and they immediately cringe, or they immediately come up with they think you're an evil person, or they just bad thoughts flood their head when they hear that word. And that's just kind of where a lot of people are at now.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
So when you hear the term masculinity, what are you referring to?
I'm referring to the way that men are expected to be within society to end up holding up kind of the structures and the balance within society. So if we look at masculinity in that light, it has to be there, number one, because the fact that it's always been there, and it's always been the balance from our ancestral days of being tribal to nowadays within society. The reason why we're so fractured in society, the reason why this narrative of ridiculousness is even able to allowed to be out there is because the fact that good, strong, masculine men are nowhere to be found in the spotlight, in the media. And when they are, the media just shuts them down because they have that power, right? And so right now, masculinity is being shadowed or overshadowed by this negative narrative, but we need masculinity, healthy masculinity within the world today to create that balance, to put to put the people who want to abuse society and abuse their power, to put them on notice that they don't have that ability, right? And we're seeing it happen right now because not enough good men are in the position to say, hey, we are going to put you on notice, right? And so that's been, when I look at masculinity, when I talk about it, it's about bringing that power back in that positive way, where we're creating that balance within society, inclusive of the feminine, right? And having that balance to say, hey, we're here to create structure, to create that powerful stance to say, hey, you're not going to push everybody around. Like, that's not how it's going to happen. Like, we got to be fair, we got to treat each other with respect, but you also need to be put on notice that there is somebody that can stand up to you.
So what do you think went wrong? Why do you think we've come to this point to where, like you said, there's not enough good men standing up? We've allowed the nonsense to continue. In your mind, where did it start, and how was it allowed to continue to the point we are today?
Well, I mean, if we it's a very big question, because I don't want to take us back too far, because doing a lot of the studying on this, I mean, I can build the story from ancestral to civilization to where we are now in society. But where I think it started at that point of civilization and corruption, right? Like, we started to take away the inherent ability of what men were designed to do for the tribe. We started to take it away with laws and infrastructure. So to our benefit, we created these things that kept us a lot safer and kept us a lot more at peace. We were no longer having to live in a sympathetic nervous state. But it also started to detract from the value of men, because then or people, I would say, rather, who were getting put in these positions that were having power in corruption, were able to manipulate the narrative that was going out to the world. And what we're seeing now is that manipulation of the narrative take hold in whatever it is that they want it to be perceived. And if you look at the lack of positioning of good, strong, positive men in the media or in Hollywood or in these influential spaces, when you look at the lack of that, you can understand why we're so fractured. Like, I would say, and I would love to know if you believe the same, but it's like, I don't know that we've been more fractured as a country than we are nowadays. And in that, we look at it and say, okay, I think it was, my personal opinion, that power and corruption, especially within politics, started to take away from seeing what a good man could be, because they're more concerned about who's lining their pockets and who's going to take that lining away if they choose to speak up, right? And I mean, love him or hate him, but Donald Trump was one of those people. Like, everybody was pissed at him because he didn't care. He didn't need the money. He stood up and said, I'm going to do what's right for America and be that strong male figure. And not saying that he did everything right, not saying that he's even the most positive, male figure to look at, but he didn't hesitate to stand up to people who were trying to take down masculinity, trying to take down society and continue to fracture us.
I do agree with, I mean, I'm 31 years old, and there's no point in my lifetime I remember things ever being this bad in
Yeah.
terms of disagreement. I mean, we've got conversations. I mean, some of the things that are discussed in serious tones, and given credibility. Just for one example, there's a woman by the name of Riley Gaines, former Kentucky swimmer. She now speaks out in defense of women's sports. She wants to protect women's sports from men coming in and competing. She got attacked by a mob at San Francisco State University. Nobody stepped in to defend her. Yeah. Nobody stepped in to defend her. It is mind-blowing to me that we're even at a point where any part of that story could happen, and it's just normal in the news. And so that's what I want to drill down on here. To me, in my opinion, young men are in a crisis state in this country. And that is why I was so fascinated to have you on and talk about this as well. They got no sense of hope. They've got no sense of purpose. They've got no sense of direction. And society seems to tell them your problems aren't real problems. There's no role for you here, and everything you do is wrong. Mm-hmm. I'm being a little simplistic with that analysis, but that's the general baseline. To me, in my opinion, in your opinion, what do we do to get young men, teenage boys, guys in their early 20s, fired up and excited again to have meaningful roles, meaningful relationships, and meaningful lives?
There's a wide breadth of things that we have available to us as men, right? And inherently we do, right? And that's kind of that's another interpretation of masculinity. It's those things that are inherent within us, right? The things that we default to and feel more comfortable in, the way we behave, act, the thoughts we have, the logical progression we have, things like that. Some of those are associated also in that definition. But when we look at men and or these boys, and we want to get them reinvigorated, it's allowing them, one, to just be boys again, right? To also have that experience of climbing trees and roughhousing and competing and playing and stuff like that. And then also it's showing them, in my opinion, what's happening is the adult males, quote unquote, the adult men, are not giving them a good role model. If you look at like Bandura's social learning theory, and you look at from the youngest ages, we're trying to ascertain life and roles around us just through the interpretation of what we see, because we can't necessarily understand words yet. Like, we're not being good facilitators of that as men now, because I think the men who have kids are actually lost, and the men who have kids didn't go through in any type of initiation. We have none of that in the US, right? Your two forms of initiation predominantly in Western culture are the military and gangs. And both of those have a lot of negative aspects to them that don't create healthy men, right? So we're looking at this as, where's the void in initiation? So you have a lot of boys raising boys, and we don't have good figures of men and mentors and guides and elders that are teaching these boys on what it means to be a strong, powerful man who also has a range of emotions, who also has a range of ability to express the way that, you know, he's feeling, or the way that he interprets life and his perceptions. Like, there is a wide range of conversation, which this is one of the things I'm going to look to work on more, because nobody's codified this. And I would love to do it, because as we transitioned to civilization, from tribal to civilization, as we transition there, we never codified really how masculinity evolved. And if we don't think masculinity evolved, we're kind of like, you're very outdated, because we had to evolve as human beings naturally, right? And so there's principles from the ancestral ways of men that are very prominent and still hold true to us genetically. But then there's also this kind of more expansive role that we've taken on too with the evolution of society, and that's being neglected. And that in my opinion is what's not allowing boys to feel strong in becoming men. And it's also not allowing the men who are uninitiated to understand that they still have a ton of value, but they have to look at where they stand on that scale of those masculine traits, and then what resonates with them as far as how they present themselves. I don't know if that answers your question like super well, but like, hopefully I'm trying to get across like a lot of knowledge with like a very succinct message here.
Do you think there's something we can do to teach, you know, men of any age, but certainly young men who are still moldable, that when they see a problem, it is not just their duty as a man, but as an American? If you see someone struggling, you have an obligation to help that person. If you see someone who's being bullied, you have an obligation to step in and do something about that. If you see a woman who's being attacked by a mob, you as an American and as a man have to do something about that. Maybe you get your ass kicked in the process, but you have an obligation. Is there any, how do we teach men it's okay to embrace, like, it's okay to step up and do something when there's a crisis?
That is a very tough question, because the fact that you're looking at a corrupt judicial system now that will go against somebody standing up for the right reasons, as opposed to somebody abusing somebody in public for the wrong reasons, right? Like, so that is a tough question. We have to get back to the version of, you know, being that protector, and also get back to the version of confidence in being a man, right? And saying that, like, hey, I have confidence in who I am and that I'm standing up for the right thing. I think we've gotten so fractured on what the right thing is nowadays, fractured in that, and then the belief that we're going to be penalized by the legal system if we do stand up for somebody out in public. Like, hell, when you and I probably grew up, if you had a problem with somebody, you go out in the parking lot, you get in a fight, and then like somebody went down, that was it. You didn't continue, that was done, right? Or if a girl got picked on, you stood up for them. And if cement, you got in a fight, and then it was done, right? Like those were things that were very okay when we grew up. And then we've gotten so litigious within society today that people are so scared to do that. And the ones that do that, one, are highly confident in themselves, and two, are more willing to protect somebody else than to worry about the consequences of having to deal with the legal system, right? And to get somebody to believe that they're in the position to do that, we got to start teaching boys how to be confident in who they are, so when they become men, that the whole point is that respect others, protect those who can't protect themselves, and always do what's right, and what is serves the collective justice, right? And all those are inherent within men. I believe a lot of men have shown that when you talk to men, coach men, a lot of those are naturally inherent with us because they're principles we took from those ancestral days of being tribal. But to get those back, it's very hard because we've never seen something nationally come in as an initiation that would work. It's always worked tribally because you're talking about small factions. Like you could probably start chapters statewide and say, hey, there's a chapter of initiation, and it becomes a process. There's guys like good friend of mine, Bedros Koulian, runs the Modern Day Night Project, which is absolutely amazing. And they do it. He's got a Squire version of this where it's for young boys. Amazing program, and he works with a bunch of Navy SEALs, an MMA fighter, and a couple other dudes. I think a former Marine Raider. So like they got some legit dudes, and they're putting in some legit training to actually get these people to feel confident in who they are, know that there's power within them, right? And know that they can have that grit and strength, similar to like a special operations. I ran one called Activate Your Alpha with a good friend of mine, Stefanos, and we took men down more of a ranger style training, but the power they gained in their lives and the confidence they gained was insane. But we have to start getting back to some of these small versions. I know, Tim Kennedy's got a school out of Texas. I'm sure that's probably a great one as well. But like, we got to get back to some of these small local level initiation, components that can give that confidence to them, because it's really about confidence. If you talk to men, like the amount of men I've coached, one of the biggest things they all struggle with is confidence. They lose that confidence, or they never had it, and it was because it was never given to them. So if we can start to instill that again, we'll start to have men stand up no matter what, because at the end of the day, the values of helping society far outweigh the chances of them having to deal with a legal battle, right?
Do you think cell phones and technology are part of the issue here, specifically when it comes to maybe the development of how young men communicate? The example I always love using is dating apps weren't a thing when I was in college until shortly before I graduated. So fortunately, I avoided that entire apps thing. I had to do this crazy thing called talk to people in person. and you learn when you talk to people what works and what doesn't work, and you're going to get rejected a lot. You stomach it, you keep on moving, you gain confidence when it finally works. Now I walk anywhere, I see people doing this, their nose is in their phone. I go to a bar with my buddies, 90% of men and women, nose in the phone. Do you think technology plays any role in some of these issues?
I mean, I believe so. And I think anybody that says it doesn't would have to be a little naive. I think that obviously technology has changed a lot of the way we just simply live. I mean, it has evolved society, and we're only going to see that further change. I was just talking to somebody about this on my podcast, but it's going to further change with AI, AI coming into practice. So like, technology is causing a huge friction amongst the roles within society. And it's also causing a huge friction within our position as men in society, because more men are lacking. First off, men didn't start off with great emotional intelligence anyways, but we gain emotional intelligence, one, through understanding ourselves, and we gain emotional intelligence through conversations with people. But now you're not conversing with anybody, and you also can temporarily kind of escape your own mind when you start playing these games, or getting into social media, or watching all these movies and TV shows. Like, people are outsourcing their life to social media, to technology. And in all of that, it 100% is deteriorating the value we have for ourselves, because at the end of the day, what is everybody doing when they even get on social media? I guarantee you, I can almost say that everybody's comparing, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's comparing. To some extent, they're comparing. And when you're comparing, you're just talking about, the majority of the time, you're seeing the things you don't have. And then you're like, wow, I'm not good enough, or I'm less than. And so that deterioration of confidence is going to have you walking around feeling like less. And no, you're not going to feel like a powerful man when somebody comes up and shoves a woman and steals her purse, because you just constantly berated yourself because you're looking at all this social media and seeing how you don't have all those things. So it becomes this, in my opinion, there's more of like a toxic cycle within it, where we're creating our own negative mindset and deteriorating our own confidence through a lot of this implication of technology. It's not to say it's all bad, but at the end of the day, like, you got to mitigate it. You got to really understand that, like, this thing needs to get put down. This thing needs to get put down. I need to get outside. I need to leave this at home, take a watch with me. That's it. And go sit at a bar and have a conversation with somebody, or go out to a social event and have a conversation with people and get to learn about them, ask them questions. Like, I grew up that way too. When I was doing protection, we would get like 30 days off, and I would go travel, and I would just travel. And again, this is before like social media and everything. I had a flip cell phone. That was it. And I would go down to Australia and like New Zealand, and I would literally just be by myself. And I challenged myself literally every night to go out and make new friends. That was it. And so I would go out to a bar, have a beer. I'd go introduce myself to a circle of people and be like, hey, would love to have a conversation with you guys. I'd sit next to an old gentleman at a bar, ask him about his life. Like, I just did these things because I felt really good doing it, and it allowed me to experience more. And I think that's what people should be getting back to. I mean, I saw this push recently where people are even starting to get back to flip phones now. They're starting to like leave these at home, or even get rid of them and just go back to a flip phone. And I was like, that's kind of brilliant. Like, if you wanted to be accessible, because phones are just a thing nowadays, but you wanted to get rid of the stranglehold that all this has on you, that's a really cool concept. But yeah, I agree. I think that, in a long-winded answer, technology it's got its benefits, but I think it's also deteriorating the social construct within society and the social construct within men and masculinity in general.
I got two questions left for you, and one of them is going to be on kind of this wrap up on the distractions, division, all that stuff. I see an American flag behind you. I think that's really, really neat. I love that, actually. When you hear people say, whether it's in the media, social media, whatever it might be, that America is a terrible place, that we're the bad guys, everything we do is evil, Americans are evil, we're a scumbag nation. And for the record, I disagree with everything I just said. But there are there are people who make that claim. You've been all over the world. You've made it your life mission now to talk about improving people, things of that nature. Someone with your experience, when you hear people slam this country as a evil, terrible place, what's your message for people like that?
I used to get really angry at it, because I was like, my brothers have died for this country. There's many great men and women who have died over the decades for this country and for the betterment of this planet, right? And so I used to get really angry. But now I just look at those people as highly uneducated and very ignorant, because when the thing is, I take the Elon Musk approach. When you start asking them questions, they tend to not have valid answers. And so for me, I just say, hey, those people are very uneducated on what they're speaking of. They're portraying a narrative that they're being force fed. And the best way to correct them is to say, well, why do you think that? And then start asking them questions, because at the end of the day, they find out they don't really have any strong stance, because there's no narrative that supports that. The light that America has been for this world is like, you can see it through every single generation, every country, ever since America became a world superpower. Like, every country has looked to America. You can watch this this globally. I've watched this decade after decade where like if America does something, you see other countries start to do it. And it's because the fact that everybody looks to us for cues and then they trust us. When anything goes bad, who does everybody want to play a role? Like they want America to come in and help in some way, shape, or form. America has been a guiding light. Now, do I believe the politics have gotten way more corrupt and outlandish? Yes, but what we've started as and what we represent as a majority of this country are people who will always stand up to protect one another, will stand up to protect those who are cannot protect themselves, and we'll always do our best to do what's good for the collective, right? For everybody around us. And I firmly still believe that there are a lot of people in this country that represent that style of American. And those are who I really believe also operate this country on the everyday basis. Like those are the people that are the backbone of this country. And so when people say that stuff, I'm like, either you've never experienced America or you're very uneducated. And it's like, no, we are exactly who we've always been, which is a guiding light for this freaking world. And it's kind of like guns. People want to get rid of guns until someone comes to harm them and they're like, where's the guys with the guns? Right? It's kind of the same thing. You want to belittle Americans until a scenario comes in which you want somebody from America who's got the tenacity and grit and strength and perseverance to come in and say, hey, I'm here too. You guys still want to play? Like that's what I believe.
That's a great answer. I mean, I'm ready to run through a brick wall right now. That was incredible. All right, last question. This has been a real fun one. I always like closing out on this. What's the funniest memory you have from your time in the military?
This one was great because I think it was literally on it was on the first deployment I had. So we had this whole conversation already. People know, like, obviously Rangers, like top notch, elite, special operations, but we also do a lot of boneheaded stuff and funny things happen. So like we're running around on an objective one time and we get information that there's another person that we need to go get. And it's a few blocks away. Right. And so we're running down and one of the squads was up on the roofs. So they were going from like rooftop to rooftop and we were kind of skirting on the street. And all of a sudden, like you hear one of the team leaders go, where's Schledel? And we're like, wait, what? We lost a dude? And they're like, no, where is he? Where'd he go? And we're like hearing this on the radio and we're down on the ground. So we have no clue what's going on. And what had happened was he went to go cross jumping over from one building to the next, misjudged the jump, fell down between two buildings in this alleyway. And then we just hear this like, like him, like, and he's got all this gear on him. So it couldn't have been fun, but we just hear this like noise out of this alleyway. And we're like, what the heck? And it was him. He had fallen from the roof. And so we're sitting there. And for me, my first deployment, we'd already done quite a few missions by this time. So it was kind of like, I was getting my legs under me, but it was just like, oh yeah, funny stuff happens to us too. He was okay, mind you, it was fine. We kept running the mission, no issues, but it was just hilarious because his team leader didn't know where he went. We're hearing this like groaning, like out of a alleyway, and it was him having fallen off a building. So it was pretty good.
Was he okay ultimately?
Yeah, he was perfectly fine. Yeah. We kept running missions that night. We even went on to that follow on. He was perfectly fine. Shockingly, he was perfectly fine because we carried a lot of gear. We had a lot of weight on us. So but he was a smaller guy, so hopefully that kind of was like his thing that helped him. But yeah, it was pretty funny, and I definitely will never forget the fact that happened to him. So,
well, Johnny, real quick, tell the audience where they can find you if they're interested in learning more.
Yeah, no, I mean, you guys can find me at johnnyelsasser.com, and my new book, Design the Man Within, kind of goes over a lot of this infrastructure of like what I talk about around masculinity, what I'm talking about, how we can kind of like reframe this. And to your point, start to create stronger men in this world again. And so if you guys want that, that's at designthemanwithin.com. You also can find me at my podcast called The Art of Masculinity. So that's the three places where you can really get me. And then if you want to go on IG, I am predominantly on there at johnny.elsasser.
Awesome. Johnny, well, thank you very much. You are welcome back. Maybe we'll run this back in about a year or so.
I love it, brother. Would love to, man. Thank you.